Again, most of our ancient ancestors, Greeks, Hindu people, and plenty of other people were telling us that actually time isn't linear but is cyclical. And I search and I search and I search. I search physics. Physics also is telling us that time may be to some extent cyclical, that our universe, because nowadays we are asking what was before the Big Bang, because scientists, mainstream scientists, are telling us that everything came from the Big Bang, and we do not know what was before that. Okay, we do not know, but there are plenty of amazing scientists, true scientists, even Nobel Prize winners, who have their theories that maybe before the Big Bang there was previous universe.
The Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with the Codega and sharing one of yours. Welcome back to Codega's Codex of Curiosities. I'm Rye the Codega, and this is the only podcast that dares to bring a lantern into the darkest corners of the unexplained. This is your myth-mapping, truth-chasing type of podcast through the shadowy folds of our strange little reality that we call Earth, our reality. And okay, guys, today's guest is Alexander, a thinker and the author of a book called Déjà Vu, Has Everything Already Been? And this isn't just a book, it's an excavation of memory, a myth, and meaning. In it, Alexander invites us to consider whether the most distant past may have already happened. And in the version of history fed to us by modern science is only one layer of a much older and deeper truth. But before we jump into this matrix of memory and meaning, I've got a challenge for all of you, my Codegas, Codex explorers. As you're listening today, I want you to keep track of 3 of your weirdest synchronicities that happened during this episode. So whether it's something Alexander says that mirrors a thought you had, a number that keeps popping up, or even just a phrase that you heard earlier today that perhaps comes into this episode. I want you guys to write them down and tag me on socials or email me and let me know what you guys hear. So share your personal glitch in the matrix, and let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes together. All right, everyone, lanterns up. Minds open. Let's welcome Alexander to Codega's Codex of Curiosities. Alexander, welcome, and I'm glad to have you here.
Thanks, Rye. It was a really, really great introduction. Actually, you nailed it. So, welcome,
Yes.
everyone.
I appreciate that. I greatly appreciate that. Now, Alexander, you reached out to me. You had written this book, and of course, I'm like, yep, gotta have you on. Yeah, Déjà Vu. There we go. Fantastic looking cover too. I'd like that. It's really,
Thank you.
It really captures the eye as well. So
I did it myself.
You did it yourself?
Yes, I'm actually a publisher here in Poland. Not only I publish my books, and I want to write a second one soon, but I also publish books by other authors which are similar to mine. But it's just a little publishing house.
But that is awesome. I like that you do that. And not only are you a writer and an author, you're also a publisher as well. So what else do you do, Alexander? Why don't you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself and where they can find you?
I'm also into social media creation and video editing. So this is, I would say, my side hustle to be ready financially for all the books and for all the publishing things. But I would say I do these things full time. So publishing books, writing books, being on podcasts like this, also recording videos myself, editing mini documentaries. Like I actually have collaborated throughout the last few years with many people. So I would say that all the things I do, many things, but most of them are connected to the main idea of discovering the biggest secrets of our past, but also of the entire universe.
Wow. Okay, so not anything small. It's this large wheelhouse of things that you do. So which I love it. I love your passion as well. And so where can they find your book? And where can they find you?
Yes, my book is, as you mentioned, Déjà Vu has everything already been. Alexander Czeszkiewicz, if you put either my name or the book's name, you will find it. It is only available in English on Amazon's, but almost all over the world. Maybe not in each Amazon, but in the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, and many, many other regions, but only on the Amazon when it comes to the English edition. And of course, I also have a YouTube channel. Maybe I haven't been active in quite a time. However, I want to come back because now I'm actually I would say I automated most of the things in Poland because I'm also a content creator and author in Poland. So now I want to reach bigger audience with the English channel. So on YouTube you'll find by typing my name and surname, it will be Alexander Czeszkiewicz Global. I have also a few side channels with other people like Atlantis Bro, with true historian Michael Leflem, also from Mexico. So you mentioned you are in
That is
Mexico.
the exact person that I was mentioning about who sent me his book
Oh,
on Amazon there. Yes, yes, Michael Leflem is fantastic. He's actually running a like a online course right now for about
mhm.
and whatnot. So it's great. We have a friend in common.
Yes, we are collaborating, so we have a YouTube channel together called Atlantis Bros. And actually, I'm in the process of publishing his book here in Poland in Polish. So another synchronicity, I would
There
say.
we go. I talked about that at the beginning of the show. I wanted people to write. Well, I'm gonna have to make my own list here. That's one of them. Yeah, Michael Leflem is fantastic, and I I have his book. It's just sitting over there on
I
the.
also.
Yeah, it's just sitting right over there on my nightstand.
I have it here too. Because many people during interviews like this, they tell, oh, it's fake, it's green screen. No, it's these are real bookshelves and real books. So here
I
you
was
got
gonna ask you. I'm like, are those
Michael's
real
book.
bookshelves? Because that looks
Yes.
fantastic. I'm like, maybe I should be modeling my studio after how yours looks. I like it. I like it. Yes.
Yes,
Um,
so
mhm.
whenever you put my name and surname, you'll find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. So that's, I think, the easiest way. Copy paste my name and surname.
Okay. So let's just jump right into it. Your book Déjà Vu has everything already been. It's a powerful question. So, what was the moment that or the spark that led you to write this book? Was it a personal experience or a pattern you couldn't ignore or something like that?
Oh, it's a long story actually, and I would say that parallel to my research and discoveries when it comes to history, because my book is mainly about lost history of humanity, if I can say it like that. I parallel to that started my spiritual journey, I would say. I would compare it to like masculine and feminine side. So masculine was all the research, hard stuff, material, evidence-based history, and then the feminine stuff would be inner knowledge, discovering the inner side, dreams, spirituality, and things like that. But I started, I would say, I started with a non-spiritual point of view when it comes to everything, when it comes to history. I would even say that throughout most of the years of my older life, I was some kind of atheist. Maybe not like very, very into the I am an atheist, but I wasn't considering anything spiritual, anything metaphysical. And I actually wrote this book when I was just 17. This book, not like a short book, it is 450 pages in English and 400 in Polish. So I wrote it just at the age of 17 because I started my research very, very early. I was always a good student. My mom was actually a historian, my dad was an engineer, so I had a home full of books, full of documentaries to watch on the television. So I was always into knowledge, into stuff like this. And because that I had everything at home, it wasn't forced. Like, it wasn't that I need to learn this for this class and for this. I had everything there, so I was like interested in that. Oh, that sounds fascinating. Let's check it out. So I was always into some kind of knowledge, maybe I would say science, but not only science, knowledge of any time. I liked history and so on and so on. So I started very, very early. I was always a good student also. I had plenty of competitions, and it was during one of the biggest competitions that I had when I was about 15 or 16 years old, in which I needed to learn. It was during my middle high school here in Poland, so beneath high school, but there isn't an equivalent, I think, in the English system. But during my middle high school, I had a huge contest because there was a change in the educational system, and I needed to actually have some contests in order to pick a better high school later. So I attempted this competition, and for this competition, it was a historical competition. I needed to know all the history from the times of actually prehistory of the hominids and previous human species up till nowadays. Was it wasn't about learning just some middle high school books. No, it was about learning high school books, advanced high school books, and even some academia sources. And it was during this time that I started questioning history, because I started knowing so much about the history, and I needed to learn this, I would say, scheme of history, because this history, if we look at it from the bigger perspective, is all one thing, all one big picture. So when I was learning this big picture, I started questioning, is it really the truth about our history? How do we even know that we evolved from hominids, and how do we know that this was the first civilization and there wasn't anything before that? So this was this initial spark of research and of investigations into how our history really turned out. And it was at that time, during this contest, that I even started searching beyond that. As I mentioned, I was searching the academic textbooks, academic sources, but also I started reading books from forbidden archaeology, alternative history, as some people would say, Graham Hancock and stuff like that. And I've seen that, okay, maybe it isn't all true what these people are talking about. However, they have a good point, that maybe we do not know everything about our history. How can we say that we know almost everything about our history, and any idea of existence of lost civilization is just a stupid idea? Modern skeptics and conservative science are telling us like that no, there wasn't anything like Atlantis or any kind of previous civilization, that we know so much about our history that it is impossible. And I would say, and I learned, and I'm always still learning a lot about our history, that I would say that we still do not know much about our past, especially these periods before the first civilizations. So I got into different sources, and here in Poland we've got a little bit different culture. At least we used to have it like 5 or more years ago still. So we are to some extent very traditional, and we have plenty of aphorisms and, I would say, idioms, maybe equivalents of idioms in English, that are telling us about the importance of tradition and importance of beliefs of previous people. And we have something like that: there always is some grain of truth in any story, any mythological, any folklore story, any legend. So I started searching what our distant ancestors were telling about our history, because we are in 2025 right now, but let's say ancient Sumerians or ancient Egyptians were at least 4 to 5,000 years before us, so they were much closer to these prehistoric times than we are today. So maybe they didn't know everything about these very prehistoric times, but maybe they at least knew something more than we, because they were closer to these times. And when I started searching the sources, what ancient Egyptians were thinking about their history, what ancient Sumerians were, ancient Indians, and many, many other ancient people from all around the world, I started having a little different idea of how our history really turned out to be during those very, very prehistoric times, let's say before 5,000 years, before current era, or even much, much more. And parallel to that, I was, as I mentioned, also into other branches of sciences. I was into biology, and I've heard that anatomically modern humans at that time existed for about 200,000 years. But right now, actually, I found, I think, a few months ago, that now even conservatives are telling us that anatomically modern human, just as we today, maybe of course with some minor changes, but it isn't about previous species, but about our species, existed for not 200,000 years, and the history started 6,000 years ago, about, or seven. But nowadays, even conservatives are telling us that it is about 350,000 that anatomically modern humans have roamed this earth. And they say that maybe they branch out from different species of hominids somewhere about 500,000 years ago. So if you're doing that on this scale, and this is what I'm explaining in my book, if you see this scale of even, let's say, this conservative 200,000 years ago, and you see that our history, our recorded history, is about 6,000. Maybe if you include the first shelters and first primitive people, it would be about 10 to 12,000 years. We see that there is a huge gap during which our species were doing actually nothing, because according to anthropology, according to history, archaeology, and plenty of other disciplines, anatomically modern humans for about 200,000 years ago were doing nothing. We're just hunter-gatherers, we're just cavemen, we're just nomads, up until the so-called Neolithic Revolution about 12,000 years ago, during which they switched from this nomadic lifestyle of cavemen, simple people, to the sedentary lifestyle of first agriculture. So it was only 12,000 years ago that we started building something, and before that we were doing almost no progress. And we see that it is a little bit crazy seeing as how quick we are evolving right now. Maybe it is our modern perspective, who knows? But I was wondering, could there be some kind of lost history during these at least 200,000 years of our history? And most of ancient people were telling us that yes, there were previous catastrophes like floods, deluges, there were some kind of previous civilization like this famous Plato's story of lost civilization of Atlantis. There were different lineages of rulers, and it isn't that, oh, there is only a myth of Atlantis, oh, there is a biblical story of the deluge, but I would say maybe 80% of ancient people were telling us that there was something before them. For modern history, the first civilization was, of course, ancient Sumer, but parallel to that, a little bit later, there emerged, of course, ancient Egypt and ancient India. These are the three first civilizations considered by us, but all of these three first civilizations were speaking that they are not the first, and that either they are some kind of descendants of people before them, or that their actual civilization is much older, at least 10, 30, or even more thousand years, which is still within the time frames of anatomically modern humans. So I started digging deeper and deeper, finding more and more evidence, finding more and more dots to connect, and it isn't that I want to force everyone into believing in the lost civilization of Atlantis, of course not. I want to show that there is a huge potential, huge uncovered potential when it comes our oldest past, our oldest prehistory.
Wow. Okay, so that is a very in-depth reason. We started with why, and then we went into all these reasons as to, and I agree with you that we are much older, and we only take things at surface value. Like, and I say this multiple times, and it's like beating a dead horse. When I say, we listen to the ancients, we see what they've written down, and then we're like, yes, this is all true. But when they start talking about past civilizations or other alternative civilizations such as Atlantis, we throw it out. We're like, no, that's just an allegory. They didn't know what they're talking about. They're just talking about legends or something else. They're just stories, not history. But you know, we can't ignore those. Especially when we have numerous other accounts of people talking about this. We have to put it together and say, yes, like our civilization is much older. And like you said, if we only really started evolving technological within the last, not even technological, but just kind of changing everything in the last 12,000 years, what do we do for those other, 100 and what did that, like 88,000 years? Oh, we just did nothing. We just walked around and lived in caves. No, there's got to be something so much more to that. There is a very large missing piece of the puzzle that we don't have.
Mhm.
Now, so let's go into more details about what those pieces of the puzzle were that you discovered that, like this is out of place or this technology is out of place. We don't. I'll let you take the lead on this.
hmm I think I would start with coming back to all these first civilizations that are talking that our history is much older, because these are, I would say, 80% of all the most ancient people telling us that it is not, that their civilization was the first, or maybe it was the first, but it was much older than that. So in Egypt, we've got the king's list, like in the ancient Sumer, but I will come to the ancient Sumeria much later. However, in Egypt, we've got plenty of king's list, and I would say it is a huge and big evidence for a much older history, because we have plenty of kings of lists from different periods of ancient Egypt, because ancient Egypt was, according to modern history, founded about 3,100 years ago by Pharaoh Narmer Menes, so let's say about 3,000 years BC, and of course ended a little after our current era, so a little after the birth of Jesus Christ. So it is about 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history, and we have sources from about 2,800, so the very beginnings of the ancient Egyptian history. It is called the Palermo Stone, and we have very recent king's list from about 300 BC, so at the end of ancient Egyptian history. And also we've got intermediate sources from, let's say, 1500s BC. And from all these sources are, there is a huge gap of time between them. It is more than a thousand years between all of them, each of them. And actually, all of these sources are telling us that Egypt was founded about 36,000 years before we think so. And there were different lineages of gods, demigods, and so on. And then they are telling us that yes, there was a pharaoh called Narmer Menes, and he united Upper and Lower Egypt. And they are also telling us about all of these later rulers that we know from history, from Egyptology, ruled ancient Egypt. And what is very interesting is that these sources from all of these three different periods are telling us about, in 80 to 70%, all the right rulers that we know from Egyptology, because we unearthed some of them. We have other sources that mention them. So these sources are very, very accurate, within 70 to 80% when it comes to chronological rulers of ancient Egypt. But all of them are telling us that there were people before the chronological rulers, before the chronological pharaohs. So I would say, if we accept that they are very accurate with all the pharaohs after Narmer, why are we saying that, oh, everything before Narmer is mythological? So I think this is one of the biggest cases, because here we've got plenty of different sources from different eras telling us almost the same, and I would say some of these sources are independent of each other. The same with ancient Sumer. Here we've got the famous Sumerian kings list, and this list of kings go much further back into history, for about 300 to 400,000 years ago. But still, as I mentioned, even now it turns out that anatomically modern humans branch out from other hominids about 500,000 years ago. So still, it is a little bit within the timeframes of anatomically modern humans. However, there are mentions that before human rulers, there were some kinds of gods and demigods and other creatures. So maybe there were first these creatures, and then there were casual humans ruling Earth. And it is also interesting that about, this list of kings are telling us that humanity appeared in a similar timeline that we nowadays think anatomically modern humans appeared. So it is another very interesting case. And also, what is interesting, to be more precise about these time frames of, let's say, 500,000 years to, let's say, prehistory of 12,000 years, the interesting case is that once Homo sapiens sapiens, so anatomically modern humans, I don't remember at exactly what age, but I think about 50,000 years ago, coexisted with 5 different hominid species. Because it's very important to note, because nowadays we think, oh, we are the only intelligent species on planet, and other monkeys, maybe they are a bit intelligent, but they are not close to us actually. However, at one point, and it isn't like millions of years ago, it is, I think, 50,000 years ago, a little bit more, we coexisted with 5 different hominid species, which were all maybe a little bit less advanced, but still, we would say these were intelligent species almost like us. We coexisted with Neanderthals, we coexisted also with Homo floresiensis, which are all these little hobbits, which were 1 meter tall. And why I'm saying that, because therefore why there wasn't such a species coexisting with us who was considered to be god or demigod or any other kind of intelligent being that was also coexisting, maybe even ruling some kind of civilization before us. And also we see all these things about giants in the very, very deep prehistory, and I often mention this example. If we coexisted, we anatomically modern humans, with these Homo floresiensis who were 1 meter tall, who were like hobbits, like miniature creatures, maybe we also coexisted with some giant species of hominid, which we maybe haven't discovered yet, because most of these hominid species were discovered recently over the last 40, 30, 50 years. So maybe we will actually in some future find some kind of giant hominids who were also here during our lifetimes, during the lifetimes of anatomically modern humans. So I think these examples are very, very important. And the same comes to India. In India, there are plenty of different tales of lost civilizations, lost history, the famous Mahabharata, the war of Kurukshetra in the Mahabharata, during which, according to this source, there actually died more than 1 billion people. So imagine nowadays we have about 7 billion people, so 1/7 of it dies. Maybe, of course, these numbers are exaggerated, but maybe there were actually large amounts, millions maybe, of people during these very prehistoric times. But it's important to know that there is, I would say, much more to our history prehistory than we think is certain. And the more we learn, the more we see how little we know, because when we start learning about ancient past, first civilizations, we are amazed, and we think that, okay, it's logical that we evolved from hominids for first settlements, first cities, first civilizations. But the more you dig and the more you learn, you see that there is much more to history. And actually, we as humanity, with all this space technology, all this technology that we are speaking through, talking through, this is actually nothing compared to the possibility that there might be. And actually, humanity knows not only a little, just a little, when it comes to our history, prehistory, but also a little when it comes to planets, universe, and stuff like that.
Wow, that I don't know. I'm speechless here. Talking about the little people, like the Hobbit type of people, and I've heard that as well. But I liked your how you related it, saying, if we lived with 1 meter tall beings, what's to say we didn't live with giants? And that's one thing that I go into quite deep. Like, I bring on a lot of people who have talk about giants. Specifically, I had on I don't know if you know the gentleman Freddie Silva. I had
Mhm.
Freddie Silva on,
I have
and
one of his books here,
one of his
at
books,
least one.
of course, he was in the Yucatan, where I am here in There we go, the missing lands. So he was here in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, and he was invited into, and he won't disclose the location for confidentiality reasons, but he was invited into a pyramid where there was a tomb of a 8-foot giant, a red-haired giant. The caretaker of the area brought him in. I don't believe he actually saw the giant, but the curator said this is the tomb with which is kind of strange. Well, I guess here in Mesoamerica, tombs within the pyramids was a little more common than we're going to find in Egypt.
Mm.
Which I can't believe people still say that the pyramids are tombs in Egypt specifically. I believe there was only one pyramid where they actually found a tomb within it, but all the other pyramids did not, and that's why they have the Valley of the Kings.
Mhm.
They're if pyramids were supposed to be tombs, why do we have the Valley of the Kings where all these tombs really are? Now, let's go back to Egypt here, because that always seems to be such a hot topic. And you were saying that it definitely is much older, and I could not agree more with you. Talking to a geologist, where he describes the Sphinx enclosure is eroded by water erosion, which didn't happen, I think, for at least a minimum of
Mhm.
he has I think it's like 10,000 years is the earliest. But I mean, no, the latest. But they could, you could be dated much, much older. So clearly the Sphinx has been there for much longer, and the pyramids, I'm assuming, as well. What information have you come up regarding those, like the Sphinx and the pyramids, those
Mhm.
megalithic
I
structures?
actually have different angles when it comes to ancient Egypt, pyramids, and all the stuff there.
I'd
And
love to hear it.
I'm also on nowadays on the middle ground when it comes to all the supposed evidence for an older Egypt, because some of the supposed evidence for an older Egypt actually was to some extent debunked that it was later. I don't say all, but some evidence that people say is evidence isn't actually evidence. However, I think that, as I mentioned before, all these sources are telling us of a much older Egypt, that Egypt was to some extent much older, that something was before, of course, the first pharaohs. I don't know how old are the Egyptian pyramids. I'm not able to date them that exactly. Maybe they are, as Robert Bovall and Graham Hancock firstly theorized, maybe more than 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years 10,500 years BC to be more exact. And the same with, you mentioned Robert Shaw, geologist, with the Sphinx enclosure. I found recently on many podcasts that I've actually been on, there was another, I think, geologist or scientist from the mainstream who tried to debunk Robert Shaw and his hypothesis about water. And one of his things may be, the biggest smoking gun, because he wasn't debunking that these layers are water erosion. Not. He was debunking that about 10,000 years ago, or a little bit less, there was a huge river in the place of the Sphinx. So if we find evidence that before that, on the place of the Giza pyramids, of the Sphinx, there was actually no plateau, but some kind of river or something, then, it would be hard to understand if these structures were built underwater. However, we can still theorize that maybe, because rivers are changing their paths constantly, so maybe they were built before this river was on this side of Sphinx. So just to, show and just to think and fantasize and to take into consideration and into our imagination that there are plenty of scenarios when it comes to how old is Sphinx, how old are the Giza pyramids. When it comes to the Giza pyramids, I actually show detailed evidence for and against. And at that time, when I was writing my book, I was mostly that there is no evidence for Khufu building pyramids about 2,500 years BC. However, I later found that there are some evidence, but these are not very, very strong evidence that for sure Khufu built the pyramids. No, these are very, very small, minor evidence that may be debunked in the future. We do not have enough data, but may also point to something completely else when it comes to this evidence. So as I mentioned, I have multiple angles. I often research everything from multiple disciplines for multiple possibilities. I do not want to be biased because I would like the pyramids to be built 10,000 years ago or more, or the Sphinx to be built like that, and
Well,
so on.
so like
Mhm.
I can thoroughly respect that. I think that that is a much better approach to this than being this biased on this way or this way. I
Mhm.
think approaching and not accepting, but like looking into every possible angle. And like you said, well, Khufu, there is some small evidence that he could have done this. I have so much more respect for you because of that, because I wish people would approach things like that a lot more with an open mind. We'll just say with an open mind, because then we can actually have a discussion, not just nope, that's it, I'm throwing that out.
Mhm.
It's this is the way things should be. Okay, so I can thoroughly respect that. Now, what are some other? Okay, so we're saying deja vu. We all done this before? What are some of the possibly technologies? Have you discovered any technologies or found that we have lost this technology and now we're kind of like regaining that?
Yes, I have an entire chapter in my book, chapter 8, Technological Deja Vu, in which I describe and analyze plenty of, firstly, claims about lost technologies, like, for instance, Hindu Vimanas, flying vehicles, or the energy of the pyramids, and so on and so forth. However, when it comes to deja vu, has everything already been? This is one chapter, eighth chapter. However, I start and end my book from this perspective of, could it be that to some extent everything has already been, like all these civilizations, because we see plenty of other civilizations that have risen and fall. So maybe everything to some extent has already been. And in the first episode, I take a look not from the historical perspective, but first from modern perspective. How long would it take for our modern civilization to disappear? Because if I want to search for lost civilizations, maybe from 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, or more, how can I find evidence from them? What I need to search for in order to find a lost civilization. Maybe I need to search for ancient texts, maybe I need to search for monuments, maybe I need to search for artifacts. So I started with modern time. Let's suppose that there was a cataclysm, or just we as humans were wiped out and everything started degrading. Actually, I found out, and as I mentioned, my dad still is and was an engineer at that time. I had plenty of books, plenty of sources. I found out that modern day-to-day use materials like plastics, like metals and everything, all of that is degrading really, really fast. Despite all the things we are being threatened by in the media that, oh, these waste, these plastics will be for ages and so on. No, plastics, most of the plastics would degrade in the span of a few hundreds of years. And we see even the recorded history first civilizations is like 6,000 years ago. And here we are talking about spans of a few hundred of years. Metals are degrading in millimeters per year, so of course maybe some heavier, much harder pieces of metal which are much more dense in metal would be still here much longer, but of course they would be impossible to distinguish from just a blob of metal because all the shapes would be distorted. However, all these thin sheets or all of these metal waste that we are using nowadays, all of that would disintegrate still within a few hundred years. So I would say that naturally, and like I would say 90% of our modern civilization would disintegrate in a matter of 1,000 years, maybe 2, maybe 3. But when we see these 200,000 years, I would say there might have been a few, to some extent, advanced civilization, maybe not cosmically advanced. However, I also, let's suppose that, as I mentioned, nowadays we're destroyed and so on. We nowadays have all these space technologies, we have some satellites and so on and so on. So what about that? What about this cosmic waste? Actually, this waste would also, it would be attracted by gravitational fields, either of planets or some other bodies, and would also be destroyed within matters of 50,000 years, maybe 100,000 years. So still a cosmically advanced civilization could be there 100,000 or more years ago. So I take everything like that, but again, Déjà Vu has everything already been, so can it be repeating? Last chapter is about cyclical time, both from physical standpoint and ancient text standpoint, and I will come to that in a moment. However, also in the first chapter, I see, could it really happen, everything? So I say, if we were the survivors, a few people were the survivors, what we would tell later generations, our grandchildren, we would say that, oh, we and our ancestors were flying here and there using some kind of technologies, they were driving all these cars. However, most of that would be, impossible for us to achieve again. So we would say it as legends. And the later the generations, it would be all that, oh, these were legendary gods because they possessed so many powers. These gods could heal themselves using some kind of magical aids, and they were traveling using their flying chariots because later generations, maybe 10 generations after us, they only have chariots, so they describe, oh, but they were traveling 100 miles per hour in their chariots, and so on and so on. So I start with this thread. Could it be that it was the case with ancient myths? And I compare them. We have the aforementioned Vimanas, some kind of flying machines, but we also have some descriptions of how they were working. And I also dive it into the technological Déjà Vu chapter, and we find nowadays that we have some modern technologies like quantum levitations of superconductors and so on. That is similar to the descriptions of the Vimanas, because they say that there was some kind of mercury used in the engine of the Vimana, and that's how it was flying. And nowadays we see that because mercury is a superconductor, but there are other superconductors used nowadays for quantum levitation, and with special, sometimes very cold temperatures, they can levitate, and it is a casual scientific phenomenon. So I take these myths and try, the same with all other myths, as I mentioned, of gods having these technologies, and that's how I start this journey throughout my book. And then I go into second chapter is about this lost history, this huge spans of times that are lost to us, and so on and so on. And at the end, because Déjà Vu has everything already been, it's all about cyclicality. I first take a look that, again, most of our ancient ancestors, Greeks, Hindu people, and plenty of other people were telling us that actually time isn't linear but is cyclical. And I search and I search and I search. I search physics. Physics also is telling us that time may be to some extent cyclical, that our universe, because nowadays we are asking what was before the Big Bang, because scientists, mainstream scientists, are telling us that, oh, everything came from the Big Bang, and we do not know what was before that. Okay, we do not know, but there are plenty of amazing scientists, true scientists, even Nobel Prize winners, who have their theories that maybe before the Big Bang there was previous universe. And the same is in the Hindu tradition, that it is like a heartbeat, that everything is expanding the universe from a point, and then at the end it is contracting, like heartbeat is pumping the blood. And it is all about cyclical universes, cyclical time, and it's a natural way of being, because our ancient ancestors, let's say in the true medieval or ancient times we know, weren't using any advanced technologies, and they were saying that it is natural that there are cycles to life. There is life, there is death, there are seasons when it comes to weather, when it comes to climate. So it was natural to them. But I also dive, as I mentioned, deeper into the cyclicality of time. I dive into physics, into possibilities, but also into, I mentioned at the beginning, some spiritual stuff. And throughout my research, prior to that, I had researched all the spiritual things, and I started, I would say, spiritual awakening of some sorts. And actually, at the end of my book, and it came throughout the book, I had, before I wrote the book, I had this idea, oh, maybe Déjà Vu has everything already been. It's a nice title, especially in Polish, because I was thinking from Polish perspective. And I wasn't, even considering that I would find that there are cases of repeating history. So this is the last chapter, that our history may be repeating, maybe not exactly, because it would be stupid that exactly the same me and you were chatting, let's say 5,000 years ago, in the exact same scenario. No, there is repeating history, there are repeating events, there are repeating personalities that are, for instance, rulers, and it is repeating throughout cycles. Some would say karmic cycles. I base that on actual, not only astrological cycles, but astronomical cycles, which are material based. And I would say actually that this my research into this cyclicality of time may be the best material and hard evidence-based evidence for some kind of reincarnation, of some kind of repeating spiritual beyond matter patterns that are governing our history, because we see that these things happened, and these are based on the astronomical phenomenon of the precession of the equinoxes, which was also, I show in my book, was known throughout plenty of different ancient cultures, and which is the great year of about 26,000 years, to be more exact, 25,920 years. And I found out that if we divide that into 12 zodiac signs, there are cycles of one zodiac sign being for 2,160 years. So each 2,160 years, there is a different zodiac sign. And I found out that history repeated during these cycles, these astronomical, just objective cycles. It isn't like some woo-woo spiritual stuff. No, this is evidence-based. We know that from science, we know that from our observations and stuff like that. And we see that our history is repeating, not exactly the same, because we've got example of modern, but 100 years before that, United States of America, this history, and we've got 2,160 years before that. It is a period of about, I think, 70 years. And I won't say that I discovered myself. No, I just discovered by other authors like David Wilcock. He is mentioning it a lot. But during the Punic Wars of ancient Rome history, this period of about 70 to 90 years was repeating. So on the same days, imagine, wars were started, wars were being over. Then there was this kind of militarization during a certain period, and the same period during this next astrological cycle is being repeated. So we are not talking, oh, one single war was exactly the same during the previous astronomical cycle. No, we are talking about spans of time ranging from about 70 to 90 years that were happening very similarly. And as I mentioned, it isn't the same, because in ancient Rome we know very well that it wasn't the same technology that during, let's say, 19th century United States of America history. Of course not, but the same, I would say, archetypes, the same, some kind of blueprints were repeated, maybe because of some karmic reasons.
Wow. Yeah, and I personally have noticed cycles. Like there is, and I've pointed out certain cyclical events and things that happen in cycles, but if you step back and you're saying that like pretty much everything is cyclical, it makes a lot more sense. It's almost like we have these little cogs of wheels that the cycles are working a little faster than you have the larger, like you're
Hmm.
saying the zodiac, which is I think is 2100 around there, or
Hmm.
2100 years every, you have these larger cyclical events. Everything is
And then we
cyclical.
have the cosmos, like the Milky Way, and everything is revolving around. And we have these larger cycles, these smaller cycles, and even smaller personal cycles. It is the same like the ancient aphorism of as above, so below, as below, so above, the famous Hermetic thing. However, it was much before that, much later than that. Catholic Church actually applied this sentence is in as in heaven, so on earth. It is in Polish, like that. I think it's a little bit different in English. However, it is as in heaven, so on earth. And they wanted to show, okay, as God wants and as the angels want, so will happen on earth. However, it is also the previous pagan knowledge of as above, so below. So there are microcosms and macrocosms. So there is the universe, but there's also the human body, which is also inspired by the higher these bigger things, macrocosms, and this like the matryoshka, that there are smaller in bigger, and as above, so below. So this is also the thing in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that we were created in the God's image. It is the same thing, that God may be some kind of cycle above, because it is not only about cycles of times, it is also about this matryoshka in space. So microcosm, like atomic level, and here we see that it is a little bit different, but similar is the solar system. It is similar to the model of the atom. So we see that it is all on different levels, and we are in the image. So everything, like the fractal patterns, famous fractal patterns that can be seen in the veins of the human body, the same on our planet Earth. If you look from the perspective of aerial view, you will see that just as we have veins, different rivers are the veins of our Gaia, of our Earth. So it is all as above, so below, both in time and both in space. And as you mentioned, it was a very, very good metaphor for this, that there are bigger and small cycles. Even in the Hindu thought, it is mentioned that there are Maha Yuga, so the great Yuga, Mahabharata. This Maha is the great, big, enormous, and there are smaller yugas. There are human yugas, there are divine yugas. So it is the same about there being different levels of existence, and on different levels everything is similar, but not the same, but similar. It is like the fractal pattern, the famous Mandelbrot pattern, which is this one that we can zoom into infinitely. If we can zoom into this fractal pattern, we see that everything is similar, but it never can be reproduced. It at no point during our zoom, let's say 10 times and 100 times, it won't be the same. It is called in mathematics self-similar. So it will be similar, and it will be very like looking like these different zooms. However, it will never be exactly the same. So this is about fractality, both in time and both in space.
Wow. There's so many things I want to touch on here. Like, when you mentioned earlier about the, our civilization would be wiped out in 3,000 years. Like, let's say 3,000 years, everything that we have created, it would be gone, like the plastics. And it's not to say that, hey, let's just keep littering and throwing things out. No, like
Yes.
people deal with your garbage, deal with it properly. But we shouldn't be as worried as they are telling us to be worried. Whether it be about climate change, that's cyclical. Whether it be
Hmm.
about the plastics, they're going to decompose. And I I haven't seen it so relevant as I have here in Mexico with plastics decomposing and breaking down. Like in Canada, plastics last a lot longer, but here in Mexico, if you leave plastic out within a year, it is brittle and it is breaking down exactly like you're kind of saying. So it depends on where you are in the world. Things will go faster. Um, but I also wanted to touch on when you said, like we're in these karmic patterns. Perhaps we're reincarnating, we're repeating these. There is always a statement of like, don't forget the past, because otherwise it will repeat it. Perhaps,
Exactly.
perhaps with our reincarnation, we forget. so that we continue to repeat these patterns over and over again to make it cyclical. Perhaps if we never actually forgot, hopefully we wouldn't repeat some of these horrific patterns that we have done, this horrific, like these wars and whatnot. But I think that's part of the process, is that we do forget and then we repeat it over. History does repeat itself. That it's a famous adage that everyone says, history will repeat itself. In the Bible, it says, we are talking about the Bible earlier, there's nothing new under the sun. It's
Mm-hmm.
all happened before. Now, I wanted to go back about, you were talking about these the legends of people flying, like that's how it changes. It changes from these, we're passing down this history which turns into these legends because we could never achieve it again during that specific time. Now, what about, we're seeing like these alien craft, we're seeing these UFO. Is it a possibility that some of these cultures, a very small percentage, actually survive with their technology? And, some people call it breakaway civilizations. Is it breakaway civilizations, or is it just survivors who survive with their technology and who are that advanced, even though we should be there, but we kind of got reset, so to speak?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, I take into consideration such a possibility. And again, even if we take a look at before anatomically modern humans, who knows how many intelligent species were here on Earth, maybe as Asian astronauts, but maybe as native intelligent species that were simply living before us and that we do not know anything about. We do not know much about our history. You mentioned the degradation of certain materials, but it is also can be applied to these older prehistory before humans, with all the skeletons, with all the stuff that we know about dinosaurs and so on and so on. Actually, there aren't many conditions during which bodies of certain species are very well preserved. Actually, you will see that most of the skeletons that we have are either in some kind of rock deposits or of previously oil deposits in coal, etc., etc. Because imagine that some kind of species, let's say dinosaur, dies and it is covered with oil, just with oil, and it dies, etc., etc., and it degrades and degrades. It won't degrade that much because this oil prevents it from degrading, because there is no oxygen with that. We see the same with the famous mammoth from Russia, from Berezovka River, which was frozen in time, and actually until nowadays we can see their blood still intact, all the hairs, etc. So there are some kind of conditions that prevent degradation, and that's, I would say, that maybe 90% of our civilization would be completely lost and forgotten. But sometimes, of course, these conditions would happen and would preserve something, maybe even some kind of technology like laptop or iPhone in frozen in in glacier or something, or in the oil deposit. However, if we take a look at this we will see that, as you mentioned, in different conditions, in different climates, things are degrading much faster. So I would argue that actually we even do not know everything 100% when it comes to these previous periods. So we do not know about every species that lived on Earth, and even scientists are calculating that probably 99.999% of all the species that existed on Earth are extinct. So we are zero. All the species that are nowadays on Earth are 0.0001 and so on. So actually, we do not know much about species, and I take into consideration that either there were some previous species, as I mentioned, the example of the previous hominids that we are starting discovering very, very recently, and the same with some kind of breakaway civilizations. Maybe they hit somewhere, maybe actually they left the Earth and traveled the cosmos, and maybe they tried to come back, or maybe not, or something like that. So I take it into consideration. However, I do not have much evidence to say that it was very, very likely, but I say it is likely, of course.
There's always that possibility. Now,
Mm-hmm.
you brought up dinosaurs, and there is something in particular that I watched, or I learned about recently. I believe it's called in White Sands, where there was dinosaur footprints alongside hominid footprints as well, and it was hominid and then dinosaur footprints on top of that. What is your take on possibility of the crossover of those two species being relevant or alive without being that huge gap that they said is in between them. Like I think dinosaurs were said to have gone extinct possibly like over 60 million years ago. But
Mm-hmm.
here we have a possibility of a crossover. And I do know that there are in some, I don't want to say cave drawings, but like petroglyphs or hieroglyphs where they show some dinosaurs. What
Mm-hmm.
is your thoughts on that specifically? Because I know it's a very
Yes.
unique question.
There is this, as you mentioned, it's not petroglyph, but inscription in Angkor Wat in Cambodia of some kind of dinosaur. It at least looks like Stegosaurus. Maybe it was imagination, and maybe, sometimes it can be that there were two things that merged together and for us look like a Stegosaurus. Maybe it was a different thing. So maybe it was, maybe it's not. However, I found out that many of these examples of footprints of hominids near the dinosaurs were actually fake. Maybe not all were, of course, debunked. I wouldn't say that I know everything, that all of them are fake. No. However, even for our imagination, imagine rock and footprints, which are like I would say there are deep footprints of dinosaurs and deep footprints of something like hominid leg. How that could have happened, how you can leave your footprint so much into the rock, so it was melting or something. This is the question we have to ask, how this is even possible. So maybe we'll see that it is fake, maybe it is so easy to debunk it. However, I would say maybe there were some not dinosaurs that we know that went extinct, as you mentioned, about 60 million years ago, but maybe there were different species who were similar to dinosaurs. We see even nowadays plenty of people, even on social media, you will check YouTube and there are people who are traveling the world and finding extinct species, which are, according to scientists, extinct, and they are recording them. They are doing some measures, some primitive measures, of course, because these are not scientists. However, we shouldn't be so sure that such species is extinct. The same, actually, another synchronicity. Today and yesterday, I've seen a post on Facebook about some kind of black bee here in Poland, which went extinct. However, it can be seen here in Poland at least for the last 2 years. It's been here. Maybe in low amounts, there weren't many of them. However, it was seen. So again, your question, maybe dinosaurs were still there, maybe some one species or two species, or maybe later species who were similar to dinosaurs existed much later during these times of hominids or maybe even anatomically modern humans.
Okay. I like that. I like that thought. Again, you're approaching everything so rationally, which is um, it's beautiful to see that, because that it doesn't happen very often.
I
Either
have
people.
intuition and I use it a lot, so I am juggling. So I try to be rational, but at the same time, I can also, in another time, maybe talk about rationality, science, and stuff like that. I also did a lot
So
of
you're a bit of
research
a
into
dreamer,
that.
but you're grounded as well. So you're up here and you're down low with your feet on the ground. Which is
Hmm.
I think that is, I personally believe that is the way we should be. We should
Hmm.
be these dreamers. We should aspire, and want to know more and say maybe this is truth. But we should also keep our feet on the ground and be have
We
that
shouldn't go into extremities because the same,
yes.
there are some people who are so dreamy that they are almost out of this world, with all the spirituality, that they are almost, not taking care of their body, almost not living here. I think we shouldn't go either way, into logical extremities, rationalism, and not into this dream state. Oh, I am ascending and I will escape.
I, Personally, that I know that kind of hits a note for me, where people, there's always this saying, oh, we're people say, oh, we're spiritual beings, have a physical experience, but which I do agree with. But people want to forget the physical side of things. They're like, no, I'm ascending, I'm going to 5D, all
Hmm.
these other things. But I'm like, no, we're put here to have that physical experience. Perhaps we
For
are
some
these spiritual
reason.
beings, but we're here having a physical
Hmm.
experience. So don't try to escape that physical aspect, because you are disregarding all the lessons and everything that we can learn from being in this physical body. Yeah, I totally agree. So, but speaking of these spiritual sides of things, that it, that conversation always seems to drop off, and I know we're getting close to the end here, but perhaps we could touch on like Lemuria, Mu, or Atlantis before we close this down here.
Yes, in my book, I started with, as I mentioned, hard science, material base, and everything, also about Atlantis, Lemuria, and other previous civilizations. And only at the end, as I mentioned, because it came throughout the journey of me writing and researching everything, I made this claim about something spiritual governing the cycles of time and everything that is repeating. So when it comes to both Atlantis and Lemuria, I only in my book talked about it from the perspective of possible science, of possible evidence. And I, of course, found plenty of things. I even had 1 hour and 50 minutes podcast about Atlantis itself. So I have plenty
That
of
that
different threads
that's
to
what I
talk about.
thought. 10 minutes of talking about Atlantis is will not do it justice, but perhaps you could drop in some seeds of research that say that yes,
Atlantis
they
in five
existed.
minutes.
Yes.
Atlantis in 5 minutes. Atlantis in 5 minutes. The most accepted, the most commonly accepted, even when it comes to mainstream source about Atlantis, are two dialogues of Plato, Timaeus, and Critias, which are last of his dialogues, which is also very important. And last dialogue, Critias, ends abruptly with the finishing of Atlantis, which may be some kind of literary thing that, oh, I am finishing this dialogue not completed because there was this cataclysm, or maybe there was something after that that hasn't survived till our time. So this is the source. However, there are pre-Platonic sources which are mentioning not only the name Atlantis, even the name itself, because in Greek, ancient Greek, Atlantis is Atlantis, like in English. In Polish, it is Atlantida, Atlantida in other languages, but it is the same word, Atlantis, and S is at the end. And this word was used before Plato, for instance, by Hellanicus of Lesbos, which we have only part of his work, but in this part there is the same name Atlantis. So there are a few pre-Platonic sources about Atlantis which may point to us a possibility that Plato maybe invented a part of Atlantis. Part of the story, maybe not 100% of what Plato said about Atlantis is true. However, for sure he was using something that already existed during this time, so there is no way that he 100% invented this as an ideal state. So these are pre-Platonic sources. Plato is mentioning that this was an island, lost island, which existed about 9,000 years before Solon, so about 9,600 years BC. Actually, it wasn't Plato who started this story of Atlantis, but it was Solon, Greek lawmaker of about 6th century BC, so before Plato, about 6th generation before Plato, and he went traveling to Egypt, and during his travel at the city of Sais, he found the story of Atlantis. Priests there told him that, oh, you Greeks, your history is only a little bit of history. We have much older history, and they told Solon all the story of Atlantis, that there was Atlantis 9,000 years before their meeting. It was this lost civilization, which interestingly had its influence over Egypt, over Italy, and it was fighting with the Greeks. So it was this lost civilization which vanished during a single night and day because of the earthquakes and flooding about 9,600 years ago. So this is Plato. However, all over the world I found plenty of other evidence. As I mentioned, Atlantis before Plato, but also in other cultures, because we have, for instance, Aztecs with their lost land of Aztlan, which according to them was before them, and from this Aztlan they actually came. So Aztlan, Atlantis, in plenty of different regions we've got Atli, Atala. In Mahabharata actually there is a mention of lost something watery tomb Atala, so maybe also Atlantis that was already vanished during the time of writing of the Mahabharata. And also importantly, when it comes to Atlan, I would only show this example of out of Greece and out of Egypt sources about Atlantis. Aztlan was this lost island, as I mentioned. However, the later capital city of the Aztecs, which was still there intact during the conquistadors who arrived there, it was called Tenochtitlan, and it was based on Atlantis. And you know how it looked like? It looked like exactly Atlantis according to Plato. So they mentioned it isn't that Tenochtitlan is Atlantis, but Tenochtitlan, which looks like Atlantis, there was main island and there was the main temple, Templo Mayor according to them. So Plato is telling us that there was the temple of Poseidon at the middle, and there were these smaller islands above it, and it was all on the Lake Texcoco in Mexico. So it was the same like Atlantis, but it was only a model of Atlantis because it was a model according to the Aztecs of this lost land of Aztlan. If so, then Aztlan, in my opinion, is Atlantis. So this is one of the other sources, and this would be about Atlantis. And as I mentioned last thing, I mentioned Egypt, 36,000 years before the Pharaohs, and maybe if Egyptian history goes much further back, maybe according to these sources, they also had this story of Atlantis. So this could give validity to the notion that it was Solon during his travels to Egypt where he found this story, which 9,000 years before, and here we've got 36,000 years before. Everything logically aligned. So this would be about Atlantis. Of course, there are deeper history about that. There is also the stuff about the cataclysm, because Plato actually put his date 9,000 years before Solon, which was the end of the last ice age. So it is logical that ice age was ending, glaciers were melting, meltwater could have destroyed Atlantis. And actually, from my research when it comes to geology, the rise in sea levels was about 120 meters. So imagine 120 meters, which is like a medium-sized skyscraper or small skyscraper. So imagine this. And all over the world, there sank about 25 million square kilometers, which is about the size of the entire North America with Mexico, Alaska, Canada, everything. Not the USA, but all the North America. It is the same amount of land, and it is all geological facts. It isn't like theories, like some conspiracy theories. It is all geological data. So this would be about Atlantis. When it comes to Lemuria, most of the sources come, of course, from very, very far east, like Japan, China, Korea, and so on, but also, of course, from Mesoamerica, and not maybe Mayas themselves, but plenty of different tribes on the area, and during the time of Mayas recorded some kind of lost civilization that was on the Pacific, because Atlantis, as the name suggests, Atlas, Atlantis, was somewhere beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, according to Plato, so beyond the Mediterranean Sea, so on Atlantic Ocean. And there was the second civilization on the other side, on the Pacific Ocean. This was Lemuria, and we have a few sources, but these I wouldn't say are very, very strong sources. So Lemuria is much more blurred when it comes to historical data than, of course, Atlantis. However, we see that there are mentions that there was influx of people to the Mesoamerica from both sides, from both oceans, which would, in my opinion, be that there were some kind of people coming from Lemuria and some kind of people coming from Atlantis. And even when it comes to Lemuria, for instance, we've got Easter Island, which is very, very far away from the shores of South America. However, on Easter Island, we find not only the famous Moai statues, but also megalithic walls, cyclopean walls, which are almost the same as in Peru, as in even Europe, Italy, Greece, as beneath the pyramids, because beneath the pyramids we see that, especially on the pyramid of Menkaure, so the smallest one, we've got the same megalithic architecture, these polygonal walls. I call this prehistoric megalithic architecture because I think that it was much before the first civilizations. It is the hardest thing to do, these huge blocks like in Sacsayhuaman, this mosaic of megaliths very tightly cut in polygonal shapes, not just squares, but polygonal shapes with multiple angles, with multiple sides. And the same megalithic blocks can be found, as I mentioned, Easter Island, Europe, Egypt, of course, famous Peru, Sacsayhuaman, but also in Asia, in Japan especially, but also in China. And in my book, I show a few characteristic traits of these blocks, because it is about being huge blocks, polygonal, so not just squares, very tightly cut, fit together as almost they were some kind melted into place, but also it is about having specific knobs and specific connections that also can be found all over the world. So this would be, I think, the remains of at least the Lemuria, maybe also Atlantis, but I think if they mostly exist in the parts of South America and especially the Easter Island, then it would be connected to some extent to Lemuria. So
Perfect.
short version.
That is a short version, and it almost leaves us open for a much longer discussion the next time you come on. Yes, and so I know we're wrapping it up here, but I do have one last question. Is so it's kind of ties in with your book. So has everything already been, or do we still have a say in how this all plays out?
Of course, we have a say, and I think that's why our history repeated, because maybe we did the same mistakes, so we needed to repeat the things because we took bad path, we took bad, and we made bad decisions. And of course, we have our take, and we can change everything, and that's, I think, the key idea, because plenty of people in this civilization, even space, are telling us, oh, this is cyclical. There would be the Atlantis cataclysm, which would be for about half of the precession of the equinoxes, 26,000 years divided by half. Atlantis was 12,600 years ago, so there would be some catastrophe coming soon. But I would say, from my perspective, and I also say that in my book, that it all depends on us. If we won't make the same mistakes, maybe it won't happen, because maybe there wouldn't be need for, again, some reincarnation and for the repeating of the cycle. There is some reason behind it. Maybe, as some people say, oh, it is karmic, or maybe because we forgot, but maybe because we were living badly to ourselves and to others. Maybe because of that our memories are wiped, and maybe because of that we haven't evolved to actually have these memories. In the Hindu cycles of time, there are yugas, which aren't only about cyclical time but also about different ages. And there are different ages throughout which, in one, there is the golden age, in which people have all the psychic capabilities. And in Mahabharata, there is a mention that there was some kind of blind man who was seeing, like remote viewing in modern times, was seeing everything that happened on the battle with even more clarity than with just human eyes, human physical eyes. So there's a mention that there are worse ages, better ages, and so on. However, there is also a key mention in Mahabharata, which is one of the oldest sources from the entire world. There is a mention that it isn't all set in stone. It all depends on us. It is harder. It is like different levels of the game. Maybe we take easy mode in one level, maybe we take hard mode, but maybe we can survive the hard mode, and maybe we can actually win the different level of the game on this hard mode. And it isn't set in stone. There's a mention that it is connected. It is also another thing about global connections between myths, because it is mentioned that there is a cow with all the four legs, and each leg is dharma. Dharma, which is similar to Japanese ikigai, which is the thing which is right. So it is, I love that, I am good at it, and people pay me, this is right for me to do, for instance. Modern example from business, society, personal development. However, in many ancient times, it was also called, in Greek, for instance, in Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Platonism, necessity. So nowadays we think we can rationalize everything. If we want to take decision, let's say we have two decisions to make, path A, path B. So we say all advantages and disadvantages of each decision, but it is an illusion. There's a right one. If we take this, everything will align because we'll meet new people and so on and so on. And this was this dharma. So it is mentioned that during the golden era, the Satya Yuga, or there are a few different, Satya and Krita Yuga, these are the names of this golden era. This cow stands of four legs of dharma, so dharma is complete. So everyone is psychic during this age, and everyone is making all the right decision because they have all the capabilities of a psychic. So they know how each decision, where each decision would lead them. So dharma is perfect. It's 100%. And each cycle, each age, the cow loses one leg. So in the next age, it is 3/4 of dharma, and so on and so on. However, in the worst of ages, the Kali Yuga famous, it is still on one leg. So there still is 25% of dharma. It is harder because it is only 25%. So maybe 75 is an illusion, but we have still some kind of psychic capabilities to make the right decision, which is necessary and which is good. So it's never, there is always this 25%, and the same is in the, I don't remember which tribe of North American Indians, which are having the same exact myth that there is a cow standing, or buffalo in their example, standing on four legs. And each cycle, each age, this buffalo loses one leg, and finally it is on one leg, which is very chaotic because how it can balance on one leg. So it is the same about even worst of the ages, worst of the times. There is still some kind of spirituality, some kind of right decisions, some kind of remote viewing, even in our material age, because we are focused very much on the material world. Still there is spirituality, still there is some kind of psychic. So it's never that we need to do something. We sometimes need to do something, but we can always, do the right thing and maybe end the cycle. Who knows?
Wow, awesome. Alexander, this has been a amazingly enlightening conversation. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I know it was a little short notice, but
No
I think
problem.
you hit it out of the park. It was fantastic. So thank you so much, and I would
Thank you.
love to have you back on again. But for those who want to find you, one last time, why don't you tell everybody where they can locate you?
Yes, whenever you put my name and surname, Alexander Czeszkiewicz, you can copy paste for the best results on Facebook, YouTube, and my book is Déjà Vu, has everything already been, so it is available on Amazon. So if you put again my name and surname there, you will find it for sure on most of the Amazons, Canada, Australia, US, Europe, and so on and so on. So just put my name and surname and you will for sure find me somewhere.
Fantastic. Or on, was it Atlantis Bros? Was that what it?
Yes, channel,
Yes.
small channel right now, Atlantis Bros, which we are creating with Michael Laflamme, who is a historian and author about book about Atlantis. So Atlantis Bros on YouTube.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've had Michael on here before, and I would love to have both of you on here. Maybe we could discuss Atlantis another time. Again, Alexander, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay, everyone. That was, like I said, it was extremely enlightening. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. It wasn't necessarily exactly what I expected, but it was better. So, like, Alexander was unraveling these threads of time and, and meaning, like a philosopher armed with a quantum compass. So if your sense of reality feels a little less stable than it did an hour ago, good. That means you were paying attention. Mine was. So, as always, if this conversation sparked a deja vu of your own, a dream, a feeling, a moment you haven't been able to quite explain yourself, just don't let it slip away. Okay. So drop me a message or better yet, even find me on Facebook in my Facebook group, Codex of Curiosities, and we'll connect those dots that the mainstream doesn't even see. So, and remember, the Codex is never closed, just waiting to be reopened by minds brave enough to peek beyond the veil. Until next time, keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way home.
Beneath the stars where shadows grow, the Nephilim's echoes whisper low. Bigfoot roams through the forest deep, and Dogman prowls where the brave won't sleep. Across lost history we wonder why, seeking the truth that time tried to hide. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks, in the void of secrets a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit, through the darkness don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies, aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums In the void of secrets, a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Legends rise from the Earth's deep core, a lost legacy we can't ignore. With every step, the veil grows thin, revealing worlds where the strange begins. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Giants, cryptids that call, aliens, histories will uncover